I'm pretty sure I used the word cannabis like once in the entirety of my whole thesis, right? Like I could only reference it in that very first sentence of the introduction of the endocannabinoid system, best known as the system in the brain that interacts with cannabis. And that then the rest of the entire thesis has to do with this like extrapolation of how we can do pharmaceuticals in the endocannabinoid system by targeting these targets. And even though all of the information that was found directly applies to cannabis and can be directly applied to cannabis, it's an extrapolation, definitely. There's all these variables, and like what you were saying about it just being like imperfect and trying to control so many things, like that is a piece of where natural products will always have a really difficult time.
We must work untiringly so that our children are obliged to learn the truth. Because it is only through knowledge that we can safely protect them.
Curious About Cannabis is dedicated to providing reliable cannabis science education to anyone curious enough to learn. To get access to free courses and other educational resources, visit learn.cacpodcast.com and become a Curious About Cannabis member for free. The Curious About Cannabis book provides an incredible crash course in cannabis science through over 500 pages of content filled with photos, activities, science experiments, games, and more to help guide you through your personalized cannabis education journey. This book has become a trusted textbook in colleges and universities across North America and is absolutely perfect for serious learners, as well as cannabis educators, bud tenders, clinicians, patients, and caregivers. And special thanks to the many individuals, companies, and organizations that have helped Curious About Cannabis meet our mission of becoming the #1 trusted source of cannabis science education on the planet. This includes organizations like Credo Science with Ethan Russo, the Kenigma, Treadwell Farms, the Spellman Report with Kevin Spellman, The Workshop, Green Earth Medicinals, CBD National, Magnolia Botanicals, and more. Visit cacpodcast.com/sponsors to learn about our sponsors and go show them some love for helping us spread cannabis science education far and wide to anyone curious enough to learn. If you like Curious About Cannabis, consider checking out some of these other learning initiatives by Natural Learning Enterprises.
Life. Mysterious and ephemeral. Breathtaking, yet fierce and unyielding. Grounding, yet transcendent. It's a curious thing. Let's explore it together. Isn't Life Curious? Available at isn'tlifecurious.com or wherever you experience podcasts.
And now, back to the show. Hey everybody, before we start this episode, I wanted to just give a brief introduction and a little disclaimer. The topics that we're going to be discussing today may be a little triggering or uncomfortable for some listeners, especially for those who have experienced or may be currently experiencing any mental health issues or suicidal ideation. I also want to remind you that this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues or experiencing thoughts of suicide, please seek help from a licensed healthcare professional. There are also resources available such as hotlines and crisis support centers that you can reach out to for immediate assistance. And if you're having thoughts of suicide, in the United States, you can dial 988 and reach someone who can help. If you're in Canada, you can call 1-833-456-4566. If you're in Mexico, you can call 5255-102-550. And if you're in the UK, you can call 112 or 0800-689-5652. And of course, there are suicide hotlines all over the world in different countries. I just hit some of the main ones representing some of the most popular countries that represent our audience. But if you're in another country, you can visit blog.opencounseling.com/suicide-hotlines and get a full list of suicide hotlines and crisis center hotlines for your location. I hope that this episode is going to provide some valuable insights for you and support for those who are struggling with mental health issues that are similar to the ones that we discussed that we're dealing with. However, please note that the opinions and the experiences shared in this podcast episode and all podcast episodes are specific to the individual guests and should not be taken as universal advice for anyone else. Thank you for listening, and take care of yourself, and take care of those around you as well.
A lot of scientists are very neurodivergent. Like, a lot of people in academia, it's like a safe harbor for a very specific type of obsession. I mean, you have to be obsessed with something to do your PhD in it. Like, you have to be, like, it's not just passion. I mean, people use the word passion, but it's like, you know, more than that.
It comes across as crazy to other people. Like, because like,
it is, though.
Because if you don't have that ability to get so sucked into a topic that you really, like, literally obsess over it, it'll destroy you because it requires so much work.
Yeah, like, your quality of life is too low to make it worth it unless you're obsessed with it. Because also, PSA, like, for most scientists, like, our quality of life all the way past getting your PhD into, if you do a postdoc, into after that, like, your quality of life is really not good. And it's during a portion of life when it's like this critical, for most people, it's this critical part. It's a giant swath, right? For me, it was 5.5 years. The 5.5 years between 22 and 27 and a half, you know, like, 28, like, it was a big, and I could think back at things that I would do differently. Part of me thinks I wouldn't have just gone straight into my PhD because I don't know, I really didn't think about that enough, like, completely honest. Like, I was just like, oh, this, like, makes so much sense, and it's, like, incredible, and I love research. I got bit by the research bug, like, so hard. One of my professors at UC Davis, I don't know if he's still around, Dr. Larry Morand, taught biochemistry, like the lab portion of biochemistry. And I was just in his class. I took his class the same time that I started doing research as an undergrad, so it was kind of like an interesting tangential thing where, like, I was in the class learning about all the different types of research, and then I was in the lab starting to do very specifically, like, drug discovery, like mouse model, rat model, monkey, like animal model research. And I remember at one point we were meeting up, and he after the lab, and he, like, shook his head at me, and he was like, oh, he's like, you got bit by the lab bug, like, he's like, I can tell there's not going to be any satiating like that.
And what years were you at UC Davis?
2008 to 2012.
Wow. So there was a period of time. So I almost went to UC Davis for my graduate work. That would have been around 2012 or so. We almost overlapped. I ended up going to Southern Oregon instead, but I was, like, honing in on Northern California, Southern Oregon, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I visited UC Davis. I actually visited campus while you were there. So
oh my gosh, how strange is it that we might have, like, been overlapping?
We
like,
almost worked together.
Right, or, like...
Yeah, we almost
well, I mean, I guess
together.
what depending on what program, and, like, if you went around and did tours and stuff, I was always in Briggs. Like, I was just always in either... There was one other one, but the main lab was in Briggs. We were in the basement. And, like, for some reason, I always worked in basements. Like...
That seems to be how it goes. That's been my experience too. Like, even when I was a botanist, like, doing native plant research and stuff, and you kind of get the sense of, like, oh, you're working with plants, and you're probably in in an herbarium, and it's open and bright. No, I was in a, like, sheltered, like, windowless, lab. It just felt like I was in a dungeon the whole time.
So I'm not sure if they redid it, but we used to have one brick that sat by the window, and it said fire exit, and it was just on the brick. But I did learn during my PhD that the basement is one of the most stable places for instrumentation that require so then I was like, okay, that's a good reason because these instruments
makes more sense.
They're really, really sensitive. And then when I was getting my PhD, we were right by the Orange Line. Like our lab was right next to the train. So you could like see it in the instrumentation when the Orange Line went by.
Yeah.
And it was different from the commuter rail because it goes faster and is like smoother. So anyways, it's like
it's like our retention times are shifting. The train's going.
Yeah, no, it was the NMR machines that could detect it. Like it was just like okay, time your NMR experiment. But actually, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the scientists in the biophysics lab actually learned how to calibrate for it because it was exactly the same every single time. Because it was electrical, so it was like the NMRs are magnetic, right? So it was like a disturbance in the electrical signal. And he was just able to like take it out because it was exactly the same every single time, which I thought was just, sometimes I think science just like that's what I get about science. I love talking to other scientists too because you get it.
Well, and it's like it was something like that. It's like, okay, this thing is a disturbance, but at least it's precise. And if it's precise, then we can do something about it.
Yeah, my brain likes things that are repeatable. I don't know. That's part of me that's definitely on the spectrum is like, I like that routine if it's just exactly the same over and over and over again.
Yep, that predictability, you can count on.
Yeah, Davis was a gem. I haven't been back since, but it's
a great campus. I mean, I really wanted to go there. It's beautiful. The Pacific Northwest, just in general, is like idyllic, sort of like in so many ways. Like, but in terms of like what I miss the most about Davis, actually, it's this food stand called Prejudice that wasn't even in Davis. It was just outside of Davis. Like, if you were going from Davis on the way over to San Francisco, like just outside of Davis, there was this like food market. And I mean, the first time that I came to Boston, and I one of my friends was like, "Oh, do you want to make a spaghetti squash for dinner?" And I was like, I haven't seen a spaghetti squash since I moved here. So she was like, what are you talking about? Like, let's go to the grocery store. There's like 100 spaghetti squash, right? So we go to the grocery store and the spaghetti squash is like this big, like this big. And I was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that was a spaghetti squash since like I'm used to them being like this. Like tremendous.
Just like giant. I miss the produce. Like that was like probably one of the things that like I miss the most. I guess I'd say I miss the weather, but I don't. I like the seasons. Like,
yeah, for sure. I dig that too. I just moved from Oregon back to my home state of Mississippi, which has been crazy, culture shock city. It's I don't know. It's weird. Like when I left this area, I was looking forward to. I don't know what I was looking forward to, just something different, being on the West Coast and everything. But now being back, I definitely appreciate the weather totally differently, especially rain. Because where I was, and I mean, UC Davis is, the latitudes are up there. I mean, you definitely have a new appreciation for just water in general.
As a scarcity.
But that's
like...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's strange when you don't have to think about it, and then you do. And the wildfires were one of the things that kind of drove us away from the West because we were living in Medford at the time in Oregon, and Phoenix and Talent, the two towns south of us, got hit by the 2020 Alameda fire. Oh. And we're like, that's a little too close. We're going to get somewhere where there's a little more water around.
Yeah, like it gives me chills because it's like I don't know. We probably shouldn't go down the like negative pathway of like how it's clear that climate change is occurring and like because my family still lives in Southern California and the weather there has been nuts even recently, but super weird. But the Earth is a living thing. I mean, like if you zoom out on the Earth, like I think it's really cool, like how when you zoom out on things, sometimes it looks the same as when you zoom in. Like
right, fractal nature.
Yeah, exactly. The microscopic atomic level interaction, like the geometry of things, like they're replicated also. Like when you zoom out, like how. If you're in an airplane and you look down a river, like it'll look like a blood vessel or a vein, it has like and or like in the desert, and then it like cracks, like all the like sand will crack into these patterns that look pretty reminiscent to like a cell, like a layer of cells on the surface of like a potato, like,
Absolutely, yeah, and sort of the opposite of that too. Like when you zoom in, like one thing I think about, because my early scientific training was focused on ecology and biology before I got into like analytical chemistry and that sort of thing. So one thing my brain is always thinking about things in ecological terms. And so when I started studying molecular biology, I was like, oh my gosh, you can see like these interconnected systems and these kind of ecologies, around different parts of tissues in the body and everything like that. It's all these systems, all systems that are interconnected and influencing each other. And definitely in that way, like the Earth is, this series of interconnected systems that include everything below, between me and you and everyone else. And so I definitely like that too, that kind of fractal way of appreciating how these systems operate. They do have these patterns, and Isaac Asimov wrote about it a lot back in the day. It's kind of like his Foundation.
The Foundation series, yeah, yeah. Wow,
yeah, they were like this idea of like.
I haven't read. Oh
yeah,
my gosh.
I don't meet many people that know what that is.
That's one of my older like, I don't know, like early high school reads or something like that. Like I haven't read that since.
It's a really good one. I mean, it's a big series now, but I think they were making it. Maybe they did. I lose track of media these days, but I think they were working on a series, like a Foundation series that was supposed to come out fairly recently.
Oh, that would be cool. Some of the sci-fi stuff, it's crazy how close we are to having it now. Like, you're like, oh wow, that used to be something that we thought of in the future, but now we're like, I mean, we're video conferencing right now. That was in one of the Back to the Futures, right? I think it was in.
Right.
I think
exactly.
it was Back to the Future 2.
So
or one.
Yes. When he goes into one example, when he goes into the cafe. And, there's like AI systems to like order your food and drink from. And I went somewhere not too long ago and the drive-through was completely, not operated by human. It wasn't totally AI, but, it was completely computer operated. And it surprised me. And something, we connected, a while back when we were chatting on Instagram or email, we were talking about Aldous Huxley. And, I think that's, his works are a great example of looking at how close we're coming to, some of the futuristic predictions that have been made in the past. Because, we're getting, we're just inching closer and closer to these, like experience machines that Huxley and others have talked about in the past as sort of like philosophical thought experiments. We're getting really close, among other things.
Ooh, it is like, it gives me the chills a little bit because on one hand, it's like, so on one hand, I'm a total tech nerd. Like my dad's a computer engineer.
Right,
exactly. Like I have this weird, I feel like it's almost like a dissonance between like, how much I do love technology, and I think it's so cool and fascinating. And like, one of the really cool sci-fis that I read recently from a friend's recommendation was, I think it's called The Three-Body Problem. And it kind of goes into like this really interesting metaphor about computation and like computers, because I don't really understand computers like that well. I'm just like nerdy about the idea of them and like the electricity. And it's also like, because electricity, like our brain is electrical signaling, like that's how we signal as well. So it's, there's this really interesting thing going on with how advanced we're making all of like our technology. And
Absolutely.
I just have like a weird disconnect between these two things that I love, because like I do love nature and I have like personal ties to nature from when I was a child, when I was younger, through my grandma, but then like kind of almost like a disconnect where I was like completely disconnected from it for a little while. And I kind of like, it's ironic because like, in Huxley's Brave New World, soma is the drug that's almost like satire. It's almost like a satire, right? Like, like soma, like mindlessness, basically. Like, and why would you ever like, try to achieve that. And so I think it's like, I don't know, I have this weird thing about how then when I went to get my PhD in pharmaceutical sciences, like the reason why I went into pharmaceuticals was a part of it was that I was encouraged to talk to scientists at UC Davis that were doing secondary metabolite research. And I was telling them like, hey, I really want to research molecular mechanism. Like, that's what I want to do. I want to look at like the structures of like receptors and enzymes and like the actual things that interact with these molecules. And pretty much everyone said, if you want to do a lot of that level of research, you need a lot of funding, which means that you probably need to be in pharmaceuticals, not in like plant, like natural, like.
I've gotten that talk too.
And it's really frustrating, but like we were talking about it just before we jumped on here and recorded, but like that's kind of a disconnect that people don't realize, is that like how expensive certain levels of research are and the limiting factors that go into us doing research, let alone if we want to research cannabis, right? Or like, you know, there's all these additional barriers and loopholes, and then, you know, the culture of then like your work-life balance and, you know.
So many elements. And I think a lot of the public have an impression that scientists have a lot more control over their research than they do, because, you know, sometimes a study will come out and some of the immediate critiques will be like, well, why'd you do it this way? Or why, you know, there'll be a million questions about all the wrong ways that something was executed or designed, which is okay, because we should be critical of studies that come out. But I think lay people often don't understand that a lot of those decisions get made for you based on the resources you have at hand. Like, a lot of times we're producing papers and data out of projects and things that are going on, and it's relatively opportunistic. Like, you have some things that you're trying to study, but sometimes in order to study those things, you've got to do things that are kind of lateral or, you know, adjacent to that thing, and kind of scrape as much information as you can to put together a paper that is worth publishing and will make it through peer review and everything. But it's not as simple as like, okay, I've got unlimited resources, I'm going to do the perfect study, this is the question we're going to ask, and we're going to control all these variables and, you know, do the perfect statistical analysis and come out the other side. Like, it really just doesn't often, you know, unless you're extremely fortunate, it just doesn't ever happen that way.
Yeah, and then like when it comes to cannabis research, and when it comes to anything that has like a stigmatization with it, like it does, like we have to write about it in a certain way, right? I think I used the word cannabis. So like I'm pretty sure I used the word cannabis like once in the entirety of my whole thesis, right? Like I could only reference it in that very first sentence of the introduction of the endocannabinoid system, best known as the system in the brain that interacts with cannabis. And that then the rest of the entire thesis has to do with this like extrapolation of how we could do pharmaceuticals in the endocannabinoid system by targeting these targets. And even though all of the information that was found directly applies to cannabis and can be directly applied to cannabis, it's an extrapolation, definitely. There's all these variables, and like what you were saying about it just being like imperfect and trying to control so many things, like that is a piece of where natural products will always have a really difficult, a really difficult time. Like how because controlling life, like you can't. Everyone who has ever tried to control life knows that it's not happening. Like,
just look at Jurassic Park. I mean, life will find a way.
I think it's like it's incredible that life has that resilience, and that it's all of this, like, I mean, evolutionary like pressures that are so subtle that we don't even realize them, but we're trying to stay alive. Everything else that's alive is trying to stay alive. And the complexity of it all is just, I mean, it's mind blowing. And the complexity of like us, let alone the complexity of the plant, and then what happens. And I think that like,
all that.
Yeah,
together.
it seems like to me also another thing that is missing, at least, or that hasn't been, you know, fully able to be integrated into this side of this like science and medicine. It's there. There's research there, but you know, there's unquantifiable spiritual and other metrics of experience that have to do with healing. They have to do with health. They have to do with your mental and physical state and your well-being in ways that they are unquantifiable. Like, which just means we can't measure them.
And like consciousness research, you know, we talk about cannabis research being taboo. I mean, goodness, consciousness research has been taboo for the longest time and still is, you know, in terms of even trying to get funding to look at how belief systems and worldviews and spiritual beliefs and practices and all of those things, how they influence physiology, which we know they do. Like there is already clear evidence that they do. But that's another area that is, you know, is just interestingly taboo in the science space. If you start to discuss some of these things in certain crowds, people's eyes glaze over, or they roll their eyes, and they think that you're, you know, Deepak Chopra or something, and that you're going to start spewing quantum physics and metaphors and things like that. And so it can be challenging to even have these conversations in a serious way. And, you know, and they're conversations I love because I think they're really important. And I think that it's, you know, we're going to look back on all of these years of medical advancements and things and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we excluded the idea of spirituality and belief systems and, you know, the inner environment, the mental environment, which you can't, like you said, you can't quantify. The only way you have access to it is through imaging, but then you still have to correlate imaging to thoughts, ideas, perceptions, etc. And the only way to get there is for someone to communicate to you what they're experiencing and what they're feeling. And a lot of times people are not that good at communicating their inner experience.
Yeah, it's like you can do some research on, like, we do know that that the brain controls things. Just like, I mean, there's tons of, also in the negative, there's tons of symptoms and like idiosyncratic like problems that people have that are arising from the brain. And then like the question is, what is real? What is reality? Yeah. And I know that like people's eyes glaze over because they're like, oh, you're the person who lives, you think we live in a simulation. And it's like, well, what is a simulation? Like, explain to me.
Right.
Like because the brain.
Exactly. Like, let's define our terms
because
first.
the brain interprets everything, and everything's interpreted through the brain. So like.
And that's the only place you live.
Right.
Like,
I think part of like why part of my journey with this had to do with like I've had chronic pain for a really long time. I was a former athlete in college, and so I have a lot of injuries. And I've been in like physical therapy, chiropractic, and like all sorts of stuff. They were thinking that I should get surgery when I was younger, but I really wanted to play in college, so I was like, no, like I'm gonna just, you know.
Golly, we have some similar backgrounds.
Because it sucks. You have like all this. No one tells you that like when you're young and then like you're just like I was just like abusing my body, like, you know, like torn meniscus, like torn rotator cuff, torn labrum, like just like.
You assume you'll heal up.
Yeah, rotated part of my lower back. Like, I mean, I played water polo, so it was also like it was.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Definitely just that type. It's a full contact sport, and I was kind of a brute, to be honest. Like, I mean, I'm 5'2" and I played water polo, so like I'm just saying, like, I don't know. I gotta stand up for for myself. Sorry if anyone's watching this who I used to play against, but you know. It's like I moved here, so then I spent some time. Like my chronic pain got a lot worse when I stopped playing water polo because I stopped having physical therapists and I stopped having chiropractors and I stopped having. I even stopped like working out. Like so, I moved to Boston and I was like, oh, it's cold here. Also, like what should I do? And I fell off of a bunch of things. Also, my like diet, whatever. A lot of things changed, but my chronic pain got a ton worse and. I was seeing like some doctors and like a lot of people, some doctors, I'm not going to say all doctors, but like some doctors, if they hear about my medical history, they like are ready to just like bust out the scalpels, right? It's like, let's get a whole plan together. You have chronic pain and you have like, and then so you get the scans and then they tell you like whatever. So then, I did an experiment where I went to a couple places and I didn't tell them about my history, where I just like didn't tell them anything, and like my scans came back totally clean in terms of like what they were able to physically see.
Wow.
And I mean, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, right? I'm a scientist. So like I've seen the scans, but like so since then I really started thinking more, I've seen like some movement specialists and like acupuncturists and like other, I mean, I still have chronic pain. It's definitely about just managing it. And the question is whether, and I've had some doctors say some fear tactic-y things to me too, like where, like to try to get me under the knife, to be like, oh, well, if you don't do this now, you're gonna have to do it when you're older and it's gonna be so much worse, which I still think it might be possible, I suppose, but like I really don't want to have shoulder surgery, knee surgery, and lower back surgery at the age of 33. Like I really, I don't want that. I like to swim, I like to hike, I like to bike, and like, am I in like forms of chronic pain? Like, yes, but does it like affect whether or not I can or can't do things? Not anymore.
Well, and the surgeries can lead to other issues. I mean, I know like my father-in-law's had multiple back surgeries and things. And he was one that was like, avoid surgery if you can, because I've got some spinal cord injuries and been through the very similar thing. They're like, neurosurgery, like we need to, do this. Luckily I did have a doctor who's like, gosh, you are incredibly young to consider surgery. Like maybe you should rethink that. But I've seen the effects where, you go get surgery and try to get something fixed, but then if scar tissue develops or something, you can have, recurrent the same chronic pain come back, or new pains resulting from, the injuries, all of that stimulus and everything that happens just in surgery. It's a roll of the dice. Sometimes it goes really well for people, but sometimes it does not. And then you're in a cycle of every 7 to 10 years having to get surgery, and that's not good.
And then it's like, it's like the contrast between like the way that's pushed, I feel like, in contrast to like changing your diet and like, and how about this, even just the contrast of what is and isn't covered by our health insurance, like what we can and can't access. Like I think I did the math, like, because I used to be on like a cocktail of psychopharmaceuticals at some certain point of my youth, and it was a mistake. And I mean, I try not to regret anything in life, but like I would definitely I would definitely not do it again ever. And I would, if I could go back and not do it, I would. And who knows, like if your brain was, I tend to feel like the brain is very like able to recover from everything, but I think that it's a forced optimism. Sometimes I think that trauma survivors have to have forced optimism, or else we're just depressed. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah,
like
yeah. I can agree.
I'm totally optimistic about the brain's ability to recover, but I kind of have to be, or else I'll be depressed. Like when I'm not.
The alternative is not worth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or like not worth confronting, but like not worth going there because it's a useless emotion that certainly leads.
Exactly.
It certainly leads to like very, very negative.
Yeah, it's never going to lead you in a positive direction, but it's definitely going to lead you.
Yeah. I've saved my health insurance companies, all of the ones out there, because I've had quite a few different ones, but I save them thousands of dollars every month, and I am paying for it out of my own pocket. Like, right? I mean, it's just crazy to think that not that none of them, I don't know that for a fact because I'm not sure, but if there is like a health insurance company out there that's willing to like include cannabis in there, and there was some sort of like reasonable situation, because I guess it depends, but like I'm in the shopping around for like, I'll probably have to be paying for health insurance out of my pocket, like, and well, I mean, I am right now, but like I would pay more money every month for one that covered my cannabis because because it would just come out in the wash, right? Like,
exactly.
And like, it's already saving them money. Also, like, it's been shown that in general, people reduce their prescription use, like in general, so that it's saving them money there. And I think sometimes people get hung up on the idea that there are negative effects to cannabis, right? Like it seems pretty clear there's cardiovascular like there's cardiovascular effects that mean that you should be more aware of your like heart and your heart health and lung health, right? Especially if you smoke, just so that you should be cognizant of it and aware of it, because there's definitely effects there. So it seems. I mean, even that is, there's some levels of controversy, but there seems to be
right. And there's lots of variables.
There's so many variables, but there seems to be a statistical association, at least, with like increased cardiac events and using cannabis products. And I think that is blown way out of proportion. I think that like that exists, and I'm aware that exists, but I'm also aware that like too much intake of sugar is the thing that kills most of us.
Yeah. You've always got to compare it to other practical real life examples. And when you start to do that, it really, puts it in perspective. I
know. And it's just, I mean, the amount of education, because even like us having this chat here right now, like it's so difficult to actually convey without being one side or the other. Like I see so often that it's like one side or the other. It's like nothing could ever be wrong with cannabis or any natural product, right? And that's also not true, because like plants,
if it's natural, it's good.
That's not always true, right? Like I mean, you know, they could be poisonous, and like anything in excess is not good. And I have certainly seen people have negative relationships with cannabis. Like it can happen. It's not as likely as with other things, but it can happen. And so then it's so hard.
It's about as likely as most other activities, behaviors that someone might like to engage in. Shopping, working out, eating,
gambling,
like all of those things have similar addiction rates.
Sex.
To cannabis, you know, I mean, cannabis. So my wife is a mental health therapist. It's something we've talked about a lot. But the addiction rates for cannabis that are often quoted, somewhere between 8 to 10% or whatever, that is exactly the same rate as behavioral addictions, which are, just very, very different beast altogether. And I think that's important for people to always like have in mind. Like, there is definitely risk, and that can definitely happen. It does happen to some people. And if you want to know how to think about it. Like, how concerned are you about developing other behavioral kinds of addictions? Because that's really what it is.
That's fascinating. Also, we do have a ton in common, because my wife's in like neurodiversity psychology type stuff. That's funny. It's like, I think that makes sense though. That like, I mean, it makes sense, because I feel like it's so nice to be able to share some of your special interests with your significant other, because there's like endless topics to be able to talk about. I'm going to have to share that one with Lane, because that is a really interesting way to put it, to compare, because I've been diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder by a psychiatrist. I don't think he knew what he was talking about. I think he's really old. I think he's probably dead. I'm not sure. I'm not wishing that upon him. I'm just saying he was super old when I saw him, and that was like, a long time ago. He also told me like I for sure wasn't gay. He was like, no. He was like, no. He was like, you're not. He was like, you're not gay. I don't know. I mean, I had no idea. He was just my psychiatrist. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know what was going on.
I'm sorry that you had that person as a mental.
Yeah, it was.
There's like multiple things wrong there.
I realize that now. Like, it's so clear now.
You shouldn't even have to think about that though when you go to see somebody. And this is another thing that my wife and I talk about a lot, is just how ill-equipped a lot of therapists are for both cannabis and LGBTQIA plus issues, because that's another thing that my wife specializes in. And it's the amount of damage that a lot of psychiatrists and therapists have done to people over those two topics is immense. And
there's an overlap. We should do something together, because it's really interesting. Like, I've always felt the way, because my therapist right now, like, who I love, shout out Sarah with an H, but like, she is one of the only people, I was so nervous to even tell her what I did. Like, I was so nervous to even like breach those conversations, let alone then I was starting to be like, so I feel like it would benefit me if I was able to use cannabis, because I do every day. So it's actually outside of the norm for me to come to our sessions like completely stone cold sober. Like, that's outside of my normal I'm like more anxious by it because my like I don't know like and I think cannabis and therapy
it's not your baseline really.
Yeah, and cannabis and therapy is so undervalued. Like we talk a lot about psychedelic therapy, but cannabis has been shown to have some like this is at high doses and it's only one paper, but cannabis has been shown to induce oceanic boundlessness or mysticism, and that's similar to the psychedelics. And in a lot of ways, it is a more approachable and way easier and more accessible thing that might be implemented during therapy. And yet I like haven't seen people, I've seen one group of people actually over here locally doing some like somatic body stuff with it that I think is just like really fascinating. I'm not sure if I'd want to do it since I think it appears like it induces you to like re-go through some of like the body things and then that's how you process
right,
it.
your body memory.
I think it's fascinating. I think it's absolutely
not everybody needs to go
right. I think it's fascinating. I don't know that I want to re-experience things in my body more than like I already have, but like I think it's like incredible when you look at cannabis and PTSD, when you look at cannabis and anxiety and cannabis and depression, and you know, like people like to point to all the studies that show that it makes things worse, but I mean, like you can also point to pharmaceutical research that also is true.
Yes.
And so it's just this really complicated thing where you keep having people being like, no, don't use cannabis for mental health. But then like so many of us do. Like, and
it's really challenging because, you know, one, it's like a taboo on top of a taboo on top of a taboo because just talking about your mental health is still not normalized. And it's something I remember occasionally because I go through phases where I am super hide from the world, don't share anything about my personal life, like totally disconnected. But then I'm like, like I have to interact with the world because life and business and like I can't just be a hermit. And then it's like, well, what do you share about your personal life and what's too much and what's too little? And I go through a lot of mental health struggles myself, and so sometimes I will share those and then realize like now people are freaking out because they're not accustomed to like having a frank discussion about like, yeah, I had some suicidal ideation like a while back and like I feel comfortable talking about it, and we should be able to talk about it, you know, those sorts of things. It's, you know, it's tricky just talking about mental health. And for me, I've been diagnosed with bipolar. My wife and I go back and forth on like how accurate is that of a diagnosis, because that's like a blanket diagnosis that a lot of therapists use for a lot of things.
I think it's a diagnosis by default sometimes too. Like
a lot of times it is, and especially if you're neurodivergent or like they don't know where to like box you in. Because I had a therapist one time say, she's like, I don't know how much of your issues are like mental illness versus that your brain just works differently.
Yeah, and society isn't
so
built
thus,
to accommodate it. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And so thus, like, yeah, you get depressed and have these issues and don't know how to, you know, respond. But, yeah, so you have that taboo of just talking about mental health and talking about, like, behavioral spectra and identity spectra and all these things. And then you stack cannabis on top of it. And then also how that ties into, like we were talking about before, things like spirituality and consciousness discussions. It really does get tough because it makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And then there's those of us that have been forced to confront it, I think, because of just our life circumstances and our place in the world, that we do think about it a lot and we feel comfortable talking about it. But I get reminded over and over again that actually most people are not there yet, which is tricky because then you're like, well, geez, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, like, or when it's like someone asks me how I am, and I'm like, I don't know how to answer this question.
I deal with that a lot. Like, do you actually want to know? Because I actually
I'm like an oversharer by default. So like, I'm also just, I don't want to like brush past this. Like, I'm really sorry that you were feeling that way. And I actually have been coming, I don't know if it was like at the same time even, but like I was like not in a great place very recently. And getting to the point where you have ideation, and like it also depends, like this is just like a PSA so that for people who don't know and who haven't had that experience, there are all sorts of levels of escalation. That's what they call it in the neurodiversity world. But like levels of escalation, and there's things called like antecedent behaviors. They're behaviors that come before the other stuff. And like, I know a lot of my antecedents really, really well at this point, and I've had quite a few. I've been struggling with this for a really long time, and for a really long time. And I think it's something that is important to talk about, and it's hard because we usually only tell stories of recovery. Like, we usually and the reason for that is because when you're going through it, you usually don't have it in you to share, because you're going through it. And then on top of that, it's also really hard to share some of the darkest and saddest things without triggering someone else, or like, you don't want to make something, you don't want to make the environment more negative and focus on it. It's a hard balance to walk between admitting the reality, which is that it's there and it happens and it's debilitating and it's not our fault either. It's something that it's not something that makes you less of a person. It's not something that makes you less good at what you do. In fact, many people who are like, many of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life are the most disabled. And that's just something that I've found to be true from like when just, all of it, from doing my PhD, meeting other scientists, all the way to when we worked for the nonprofit, teaching music, neurodivergent adults. Like, there's just this balance there. And I think being honest about it and having community healing around that, and around creating that community healing, is something that still some people aren't ready for, because they still view it as a personal flaw. Like, they still still view it as like, if someone is listening to this right now and thinks that either one of us is a lesser scientist because of this, I'm just going to tell you that you're wrong, because it doesn't make either one of us less able to do the things that we do, but it does give us a different experience and a different context around life. And like, and without even going into this, like, but the spiritual part of it, and without going too deeply into that, it's this entirely different spectrum of emotions and experiences. And like you said, when then you pile on cannabis on top of that with that stigma, people will say that that's the reason why that happened, which everyone could argue about it as much as they want. I mean, like, so I started smoking when I was 15, and statistically, I think that it's like, people are like, in the statistics of the scientific published literature, it is said that meant that I was more likely to like have been depressed, experience mental health problems, et cetera, but I mean, and this is just from me being in my own brain and having the experience of it in my own brain. Did cannabis change my brain permanently? Yes, I think it absolutely did. I used it too heavily during that portion of my life that it was like, I didn't realize it was medical. Had I been more educated, maybe it would have been different. It absolutely changed my brain chemistry. Do I think that it changed my brain chemistry for the worse? No. Because I was literally self-injurious and suicidal beforehand, and now I'm alive and happy, and I'm on this path of like this really long journey that will last forever, maybe even past this lifetime, right? Like this really long sort of thing that's going on that was, in part set in motion by cannabis. I mean, the first time that I ever smoked was the first time I ever was able to look another human in the eye, and like, it was an incredible experience. And I want us to be able to talk about mental health so much with cannabis, because, it's a significant, I think the top 3 reasons people use cannabis are sleep, pain, and anxiety. Like, and all 3 of those are mental health things. Even though anxiety is kind of the only clear cut one that, but all 3 of those are mental health things. Like, why can't you sleep? Like,
and the impacts of not sleeping.
Like quality of sleep and like night terrors and everything. And so cannabis is just, it's part of it. And we never talked about the therapist thing. I really do think like we'll have to have some sort of much longer follow-up conversation. Maybe we should record that too, because it'll be fun. But I think it's really, I would love to make something accessible for therapists, because I've actually had the best relationship with therapists, but I've had the most difficult time finding one that I work with. well.
Yeah.
But it's like the amount of education on drugs in general, like all drugs, like not just cannabis, but like not just cannabis, but the psychopharmaceuticals too. Like the knowledge around those, and then the fear that then, like, if your clients can't talk to you about the drugs that they're using, then that's not an honest relationship, because like it's a dangerous thing that we all should be able to talk to our mental health professionals about. And our mental health professionals should know, they should at least have the basic knowledge of which things don't mix well together. And like, you know.
Yeah, and not having that knowledge, and you know, it just in general being in the dark about those sorts of things only either causes or perpetuates harm in some form or another. And so by better understanding those things, and by better understanding them, your perspective changes, and you know, and then how you think about someone's behavior changes. You know, all of those things influence each other. And like you said, you know, cannabis, it's like when someone's using cannabis at a young age, it statistically tells you that there's a correlation that, you know, some other things might happen later or whatever. And it's one of these things of like, well, is that the case because, you know, are these things comorbid because people find effective self-soothing, self-medication, you know, through cannabis? And so, yeah, they tend, you know, cannabis use tends to happen early if they find it, because it tends to treat things that they don't understand that they're dealing with, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or is it, you know, the sort of old school way of thinking about it from, you know, when we grew up, you know, kind of the lessons taught is like, oh, you do drugs, well, then that, you know, negatively impacts your development, makes you stupid, and then all these other negative consequences come later. Yeah, and we're finding now, like, you know, no, it's a much more complex situation than that. These things are comorbid for all sorts of different reasons, but it tends to relate to self-medication, that people, you know, kids, they don't have a way of thinking about what they're experiencing, and until they're about 23 or so, you know, there's all sorts of changes that can still continue to happen, very substantial changes, that can be very confusing and everything. So, you know, it's like a chicken and the egg kind of thing, and cannabis does change the brain. It does influence all of these things, and I'm so glad you pointed out, like, the better question to ask is not, does cannabis affect the brain? Like, duh, yes, it does. But what is the overall sort of utility of that change? Has it improved quality of life or made it worse? And that's supposed to be how therapists think about cannabis use disorder. Technically, like, when you look at the DSM and read it carefully, even though I have a lot of issues with the DSM in general, but as it's written, you're supposed to take some of these things into account when you're dealing with the patient. You know, if they're self-medicating and they're showing signs of tolerance and possible withdrawal if they stop and things like that, you're supposed to relatively ignore those things, because it's like, well, yeah, if they're self-medicating, of course they experience those things. Of course dose escalates. Of course they have, you know, tolerance that happens and all of those sorts of things. However, a lot of therapists do kind of, you know, what you experienced, where they're just like, oh, you use cannabis this much? Cannabis use disorder, boom.
It's so blanket. Like, it's just like, oh, like, you're a daily user? I think that's kind of the key, the daily use thing. Like, oh, it's not just on the weekends? And it's like, no, because it's for my health. I don't want to only feel good on the weekends. Like...
Exactly. Like, yeah, my mental health doesn't really care what day it is.
I actually need to produce more during the week than I do. Like, if anything, the weekends, it's less important. Like, you know. Or,
yes. Yeah, exactly.
But I wanted to say, so a word that I can't remember where I came across this, but, oh, okay, yeah. When I was in grad school, I met up and did an interview with another grad student that was at BU Medical, and she was doing her doctorate in, like, public health, like, systems, and she called it was like synergism of shared vulnerabilities, That was something that she was describing in terms of drug use, trauma, race, socioeconomic status, like this like really complex picture of what can cause something to happen in someone's life that then causes something else to happen, and the question of whether something is like the cause or the effect, or if there even is a cause and an effect for us. And I'm really glad you pointed out that there's like a fault in the DSM, because I think it's really important as scientists to communicate to people that the DSM is a mandatory categorization by symptoms of mental health stuff. And it really is only in place because of our insurance system. Like,
yeah, I was going to say, primarily in the U.S., like other places have already ditched the DSM.
Well, because it's actually the more we learn about neurodiversity, the less we are able to say that anyone fits in one category. And there's been a couple different papers that have come out in the last like year or two where they actually go through and they analyze the DSM. Like they analyze the like the quality of the diagnostic criteria. And they basically find that there's a bunch of overlapping symptoms, there's no biological relevance whatsoever, that even the pharmaceuticals that we use to treat them, which overlap in a ton in a bunch of different classes, many of them we don't know anything about molecular mechanism at all. I mean, we have ideas about it, but we don't know for sure. It's like, that's why I have a hard time whenever people say, oh, how much more research in cannabis? I had a politician to me, like a local city councilor, say to me the other day, we need more research. Like, we definitely need more research on it. And like, I think it's true. I will always say that we need more research because I'm a scientist. But
of course,
I don't actually believe we need more research. Like, in terms of like whether or not,
need more research for what?
Right, like not to determine that it's safe and effective. That's my that's my opinion. Like, we need more research to figure out the better and best methods, the best practices, the best formulations, the right safeguards to have in our community to reduce harm and maximize the therapeutic potential. But I don't think we need more research to just say, hey, this is a great alternative, and in many ways it's way less toxic than some of the other things that we push heavily as the first line. And to me, that it doesn't make any sense. I looked it up because I was curious. If you just go to PubMed and look up how many publications there are total, there's like 39,000 cannabis publications, like 35,000 or something psychedelics publications, and then only like 3,000 publications on Ambien, which is like arguably one of the most like popular sleeping medications out there, which, by the way, can wake people up from comas, and we don't know why. Like, we could take a guess, but like and I have like, I have a personal bias, like I should disclose, right? I have medical trauma. Ambien was the first prescribed drug that I was ever given. And I certainly didn't respond well to that, but also I'm neurodivergent.
Yeah, I don't respond well to Ambien.
Yeah, I don't sleep, so then I'm just tripping badly.
Same.
Like in a bad way.
That's exactly what happens to me.
But we are weirdly similar. Wow. It's unfortunate that that wasn't like told to me. I don't know. I'm sure it was in the side effects like thing. I was
right in the long list of side effects.
I was like up in the middle of the night making all my roommates hot chocolate and trying to convince them that there was a footbridge between California and Hawaii and that I had walked it. Like, before, like, everyone was like, I'm pretty sure that's not true. But then, like, the next day, everyone was like, you were so certain, though, that you had walked from Southern California to Hawaii.
Oh, you did it. Yeah.
And I had zero memory. Just like, no memory of that whatsoever. And
that's one of the things that's really freaky about it is the amnesia after.
Oh, totally. It got really bad. I mean, that was the beginning of the beginning of all of it. And so when I started looking into GABA. Like, I think it's fascinating that Ambien, or Zolpidem, that's its drug name, or its molecular name, that it binds to the same site as the benzodiazepines. So that would be Ativan, like Klonopin, like Xanax, Valium. So it binds to the same site, like the same spot, but it has a different effect, like because the shape is different. And that change is like the difference between the effects of the benzodiazepines, and like that blew my mind. Like that was like, oh, I have to go into structure activity relationship between like
oh my god,
it was like it's just like oh man, it's like, but that's the thing too, especially being neurodivergent, right? Like, and like you were saying about the categories thing, like I try not to categorize. Like I mean, the thing is, if I needed to have a diagnosis for some form of insurance something, I'm sure I would go seek it again. I've had like every diagnosis though, so it's kind of hard to.
That's the
like,
that's the thing.
it's kind of hard to be like, oh well, when I was younger I was this and now I'm that. It's like, no, I've always just been neurodivergent, and depending on like the environment in your life and the different things that have been happening, and like for all of us because of COVID and that happened,
Huge
trigger, I mean, it's everything changes, and all of us are going through this. We are all products of our environment in so many ways. A lot of us have developed specific coping mechanisms to be able to function independently in society, like masking and all sorts of like skills to be independent, because the goal at least the goal for most people in life is to be independent, or to be able to exist in I guess in capitalism or in life, and be able to have a roof
in this system, this game,
whatever we want to call it. I mean, society. And it's the thing with the whole categorization is that it helps us to find community. It helps us to find it helps us to find other people that can help us with similar things, because like I don't know if you like weighted blankets or like weight and like weighted vests and stuff, but like I love them. Like there is a period of time where I was literally spending about 40%, like every moment that I was asleep, and then from the moment that I got up, got dressed for work, and got home, I was under like a 40-pound weighted blanket, because it was the only.
Oh man, I wish I.
The
had
only
one.
thing.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I just get my daughter to lay.
That's
on top
perfect.
Of me. I'll say,
or
will you just come lay on top of me?
Or a large dog. But it's like things that can help that I didn't know until I was connected to my wife Lane, and to the neurodiversity community, and to the movement that's going on right now about talking about mental health in a very different context, and that neurodiversity should be a really large, over-encompassing word. So I think that there's some confusion, because a lot of people use the word neurodivergent as in place of autism.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good clarification to me.
That's how I feel about it, and that's how I know that there's some other advocates that feel the same way, mostly because a lot of us have been diagnosed with more than one thing. So, and that we can only speak from one experience, and that like it's very difficult to see sometimes, like, especially working with communities and students and people, and like magnificent people, but working with people who have difficulty with communication. Like I had times where I had difficulty with communication. Like when I was younger, I displayed selective mutism. Like it's like, it's very difficult. And I remember what that feels like to not speak. Like, so it's very difficult, I think, sometimes to, I guess, like, look at one thing and say like, oh, like I'm clearly autistic. Like, look at something like, and especially because like for both of us, and we're older, I mean, we're not old. I think we're still like, in the prime, but like, but we're older. So adults don't get services. Like, the services are very focused on anyone under the age of 22. And so is diagnosis. And I mean, so is funding. Like when we were running our nonprofit, is like getting the funding for adults was way more complicated than getting the funding for kids. We would be going to all of these like galas and whatever, the stuff that you go to when you run a nonprofit. And we would go there, and a lot of the presentations would be about how, this percentage of kids will struggle with it for their entire lives. And I would always kind of be like, yeah, and the rest of their life is called adulthood, and it's the majority of our life. Like, actually, I mean, it's not the subjective majority that we experience in the brain, because I think that's also messed up, but the brain experiences most of its memories earlier on. But like time-wise, it's, our adulthood is everything past 18 to 22-ish, depending on, when you left the nest, or when it ended up happening. So it's just something that's like, it's such a complicated topic, and cannabis I find to be a very neurodivergent community, which I love, because I really only vibe with neurodivergent people. Like, not, I've definitely gotten in trouble with this before too, where like I will just like casually say to people that like, especially like, I don't know, because to me it just seems like such a given, but like if I get along with someone, it's highly likely they're neurodivergent. Like, because I just don't find neurotypical people that interesting. Like, I feel bad. I'm not actually, I don't have to feel bad saying that.
I know
like,
exactly what you mean.
But you know what, not everyone has to like everyone. So like, I'm really sorry if that's offensive to say, but like a lot of people don't like me. So that's,
No, I know exactly what you mean. Cause like from my experience, there's like multiple levels of connection with people. There's sort of the superficial, pleasantries and civility that we do just because we're kind of trained that we have to, which is very hard for people that don't fit into that sort of quote unquote normal box. Because like for me, something my wife stays on me about a lot is I tend to kind of be blunt, and I want to say what I'm thinking and want to say what's true. But a lot of people don't actually want that. And that's something like like going back to like when people ask you how you're doing, like if you ask me that, I'm going to tell you, most likely I'm going to tell you how I'm doing, how I'm actually feeling. And so, I struggle with the superficial layer, and I've gotten good at it to a degree because I'm a performer. Like growing up, my dad was a preacher, which is a performance. And I witnessed that and learned a lot from it. I was a musician. I was also in theater. I know how to perform. I know how to act social, even though I'm incredibly not social at all. And but there's a big difference between those interactions and then like the deep, true, like really serious connections that you can have with a person, where it's like, okay, we get each other like very quick and like understand where we're coming from. I don't feel like I have to second guess what I'm wanting to communicate, and we're just able to go. And that's just a very different human interaction. And so that's kind of how I'm conceptualizing what you just said, is that like, the people, because I go through this too, the people that I find that are more, they don't have to be like me in the same way, but just that they understand what it's like, I guess, to have that experience of the world, and just the brains just work differently, and a lot of it is the sort of doing away with the pleasantries. Like, I don't know.
It's the depth.
That's been my experience.
I feel like it's the depth of the conversation. Like that, like the really interesting talk. Like, I mean, this is also definitely a neurodivergent thing, but like, I really am only interested in a few things. Like, so if people are not that interested in like drugs in the brain or like social interaction, society, and like that kind of like more abstract, like really abstract, what is reality type things, like it's hard because I don't want to talk that long about how, like, I don't want to talk super long about the weather, or, other, like, and I think I totally get, like, it's masking, and we again, something in common.
Yes, masking. Yes.
It's performance, but masking is performance, and like totally, I'm a performer too. Yeah. Like, I mean, it was practice getting my videos to be the way they are, and I did when I was younger. I did Broadway style, kind of like, as a kid, I was into it before, like for a little while, and I'm still into it. I really love musicals specifically. My wife refuses to go see Les Mis with me because every time we watch the movie, I'm like singing under my breath. I can't stop it. Like, I love it. Like, I love that. I love Miss Saigon. I love Phantom. Like, like, I love them all. And
oh man, you get along with my wife.
Oh, I have them all memorized.
She's the ultimate musical, like,
oh my gosh.
Which I've gotten into it from her, but like now I've been exposed to so many of these musicals. But yeah, it's a big part of our lives too. Lots of singing.
Oh, because the
musicals.
ballads in music, the emotion that I've like the emotion that goes into it. Like so, like Lane and I, our original music, which am I allowed to curse on here? Just so I could.
Yeah, you're
okay.
fine.
So our original music has been described as fucked up folk, and mostly because we write a lot about mental health and PTSD, and we write a lot about our past, and because a lot of our music came from the beginning of us getting together and how difficult that was. But I draw a ton from like Broadway, a musical style, like ballad type, like, because I think that music also has this different emotional connection. And I actually was doing an interview about creativity in music and cannabis, and I think that there's so much unexplored there too that it's clear that it interacts, but I haven't seen actually like a single study that looked in it. I haven't looked very recently to see, but
they're not very good. Like the ones that have been done are not. I mean, and this is no disrespect to the researchers. But they're not very good.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's hard. I feel like it's so hard to do. Like it would be an incredibly
it is.
It'd be an incredibly difficult thing to even, like, again with the unquantifiable, right? Like when I I pretty much have never gotten on stage without cannabis. I don't think I've ever gone on stage without it, and I rarely practice without it, honestly, because I don't feel the same emotional connection to what I'm doing. And that's just something that I struggle with in general, is feeling connected to my body and just staying grounded, staying like in the present. And these are things that, like, I think they're all parts of cannabis, that they're all parts of how cannabis can help in mental health. And a lot of them are ways that are, like what you were just saying about, like, having different interactions with people when you're not masking, when you're able to drop that and just kind of like have a different interaction. I have found that cannabis helps me drop it because I am not in control of whether or not I'm masking all the time. Like, it's not something I turn on or off. It's am I comfortable and relaxed around you or not?
It's like it's just an adaptation to living in a social society like we do. That's my experience too. Like, you don't choose; it's a reflex.
Yeah, it's a safety thing. Like, I was bullied as a kid, right? I mean, I'm actually very thankful that I was bullied pre-internet. Like,
oh my gosh,
I know that seems weird to say, but I'm so grateful that the internet was not around when I was getting bullied. Because all I had to deal with was getting shoved up against things and stuff and, like, whatever. I mean, it's not ideal.
Right, things you have to deal with when you're at school or in front of people.
But it wasn't this, like, gnawing thing that was on my phone, people not liking me and stuff, and then saying mean stuff. Like, kids are mean sometimes. It's like, I mean, kids were mean when we were young, too. But anyways, I just feel like
their power has increased.
Well, the anonymity of the internet is, I mean, that's what's hard about creating. That is something that's difficult about creating content. And I mean, I'm really happy that we've been able to chat so much about mental health and cannabis, because it's really complicated and really hard. And I have a hard time talking about it, honestly, because I mean, I have a hard time navigating what you said about, like, navigating what is and isn't, like, the better thing to share that helps other people, but that also is authentic and isn't just like a fairy tale from Disney where, like, I'm, like, about to sing a musical about how I'm always going to be healed with cannabis. Like, it's not the way it is. It's that cannabis is part of an entire lifestyle routine that, even if it's done perfectly, it might not always be enough. Like, because life
absolutely
happens. Life is unexpected.
Oh, and that's a great. There's a couple of points I wanted to highlight there. One, I think a lot of people especially people that don't use cannabis, have a misconception that cannabis detaches you from your emotions or causes this emotional bluntness, which for some people it does. That is a thing that happens depending on your neurotype, which is a concept that doesn't get talked about enough. But for myself, and it sounds like for you and probably a lot of people that are kind of in a similar, sort of way, is it can actually bring you into your emotions. And one thing that I definitely deal with in my brain, however you want to categorize me, is that dissociation, especially when I'm under a lot of stress. This was a big issue last year for me. When I'm under a lot of stress, I dissociate entirely, and it gets really, really bad. And cannabis can very quickly bring me back into myself, and reconnect and better feel. And so in this context of talking about cannabis for mental health, I think it's important for people to understand that cannabis can have that effect, because I do think it's so often associated with emotional blunting, and that just isn't always the case. I mean, I've had times where I've been totally dissociated. I smoke, I come back into myself, and then I cry because I'm like, it's just like, oh, boom, we finally, are feeling, and like whatever connections needed to be established to, let this stuff through, have finally happened. So I wanted to highlight that just because I think it's something people don't think about too much, and I think it is a common misconception around how cannabis affects the psyche and mental health, that it's important for people like us that have experienced these things to talk about it and let people know, like, actually it can have the opposite effect that you may assume it will have. So I just think that's kind of not necessarily intuitive for a lot of folks.
Yeah, we're battling that. We just are battling what has been the loudest stereotype, for a while, and people see it as a crutch. Like, people see it as something that, and even if people accept it as medicine, it's a journey because it's complicated, but I totally agree with what you're saying. It's important for people to know also that there's just all types of use. And that we should evolve, in my opinion, we should evolve our use,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a constant, there's this concept of the self-inventory that is really something that ideally, it's kind of seasonal. Like, there are a lot of systems that have been developed that revolve around this happening usually in the fall or winter. That there should always be time carved to self-reflect, understand your relationships, not just with cannabis, but all things, just like your place in your world, and trying to decide how you want to proceed intentionally and mindfully from that place. And so I agree, like, it's a dynamic thing that's always changing, and as people, we're not static. Even though it can feel that way in the sense that, like you mentioned, our childhood memories, our brain values those more, and holds on to those more than our adult memories, even though we live more of our life as adults than kids. And now I'm losing track of where I was going to go with that thought.
I don't know where you were going with that, but what it was making me think about was just how hard, like, how we think about changing our behavior, right? And changing, like, that it appears so hard because of all of that, like, subconscious, really, stuff. Like, our brain is acting a lot of the time without our own activity. I mean, I think I try to bring this up too when I think about it, when someone has brought up to me, so my wife's family, some of them are in the South, and I'm actually going to South Carolina this weekend. And
nice.
And I mean,
you won't be too far.
Oh, cool. I'm like, I had a really hard time, to be honest, the first time that I went down there. I just had a really hard time because I grew up in Southern California. My grandma and I spent a significant amount of time in Hawaii, where Japanese Americans are actually, like, the majority there. And then I've lived in Boston, since then. Now I'm in Salem, but I mean, whatever. It's like similar area. I had a really difficult time. And I think that the like what's the word I'm even thinking about, like with culture and like with like the indoctrined like subconscious, like underneath the surface level things that happen. It's when all of us have that going on and we're not conscious of it, then it's a problem. And I'm going to be completely honest and say that up until very recently, I have had a very negative association with a Southern accent. I have had
That's normal.
a very negative, like I have felt like it made me unsafe to hear someone speak with that accent. And it was something that way more recently I've been trying to reframe and rethink about and understand. And I mean, thankfully, like to me, thankfully that it's something that's on my radar so that I can change it and so that I can think about it, because it's something that's a prejudice. It was, I probably still have it a little bit, but I'm trying to get rid of it. But I have a prejudice against people who have a Southern accent. And it was like based upon some very niche interactions, which with only, it was the same type of stereotype that someone else would turn around and apply to me because I'm a person of color on the trans spectrum. Like it's a very similar thing. And bringing that to your awareness to change it is not like an easy task. It's not something that it requires a tremendous amount of work and effort and self-reflection. And like cannabis to me has opened the door. And from what I in general find in the cannabis community is that I feel like cannabis can be an entry point into that perspective shift that can allow us to have those conversations or have those thoughts and change our behaviors and change our perspective and shape our lives.
In some ways, it kind of relates to the forgetfulness aspect, and kind of how cannabis helps with PTSD and other things of almost kind of tricking your brain to forget your prejudices for a while, to be in the moment and have those interactions. But I'll tell you, like, for me, I grew up masking my accent, and I still do it. I was born and raised in central Mississippi, about as deep in the South as you can get. And when I moved to Oregon, most people assumed I was from Oregon. And when I told them where I was from, I mean, this happened to be over and over and over again. They say, wow, you don't have a Southern accent at all. You sound like you're from here. And that's a learned adaptation from growing up in the South and being aware of that prejudice and not wanting it to happen to me, especially given the type of work that I wanted to do, wanting to get into science and education. And even though my sort of targets changed a little bit, I've always been in that world. Like, I'm going to be doing science in some way and teaching in some way, writing and that sort of thing. And that's something I'm struggling with as a Southerner right now, because my brain has, just like the other types of masking that we've talked about, I mask in other ways that I only recently became conscious of, and it relates to a sort of sense of shame that I have of where I'm from, because of just knowing and seeing those prejudices in action. I was actually, I was in Florida recently, working with a consulting client of mine, and we were talking about this very issue, and I said, this is a person that knows a ton about growing cannabis. They've been growing cannabis most of their lives, very, very skilled grower, but they live in the South, and they've traveled around doing projects and work in other places. And I asked him, I said, have you had experiences where people have thought you were stupid because of your accent? Because he has a very deep Southern drawl. And he was like, yeah, absolutely. He said, yeah, and he started telling me all these stories of times when, business deals would get compromised or people wouldn't take him seriously on a project. or would kind of like go over his head because they felt like he didn't know what he was talking about. Whereas if he had just had a different accent or not said where he was from, they would have treated him like a master grower or something, and it's just and I haven't. The only way that I've dealt with that personally is when I tell people where I'm from, and I can see it in their eyes that there's a number of things that change in their perception once they know that I'm from Mississippi. And it's happened some too since I've moved back. And when I've set up meetings and stuff, and they say, "So you're out of Oregon, right?" And I say, "No, Mississippi." The tone changes. Like you can feel it. So it's interesting you bring this up because it's something I'm wrestling with actively in the moment.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry about that. Like, I think that I think that it's like contrary, and it's not to say that it's like the same at all of other types of prejudice. Like, what I mean? It just is a type of prejudice. It is. Yeah. It totally is. And I just brought it up because it's an example of one thing that I've been very consciously trying to change ever since I've met like some brilliant scientists who have Southern accents. Like, and yeah. It's not just about that. I mean, it's also about having family in the South and actually going there. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before that, it was this really huge, unknown, unsafe, scary place where, I still to this day, like, I want to do a cross country road trip, but my family's like, don't drive across America. Like, you're not safe. Like, you're not as safe as you think you are, And that's the way that I was raised. And there's a good reason why they feel that way. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important to have all these conversations because and it's not to overshadow or any other any other thing. It's just something that is happening everywhere. And it's okay. How about this? It's like, I don't really get the inconsistency. Like, I don't understand when something matters one time and then it doesn't matter when it's that same thing somewhere else.
I agree.
And so that's something that I've struggled with cannabis because coming from a pharmaceutical background, I can't understand why, I have a really difficult time when it's like, okay, so it's this way and then it's this way with cannabis, but it's this way with all of the other pharmaceuticals. But and I think it's the same, it's the same thing. And and I think originally we were talking about just trying to change that behavior and change it. And I think it's undeniable to me that cannabis has the ability to help people see through some other types of changes too. And I don't know, it's just so good. I really love cannabis. I've been loving it since I was 15. I remember one of my favorite songs when I was in high school is Cottonmouth Kings. And it's and the first line is I'm gonna smoke weed for the rest of my life. And it's I remember, I remember thinking, I think at some point, it was brought up to me at some point that I would probably change my mind about it. And I can't remember who said it. I wish I did so I could shoot them a text and be like, hey, what's up?
Still at it.
Still here 18 years later, same aspect. But I guess I've shifted a little bit more in terms of my use patterns of it have shifted, certainly. Yeah. But I still think that it's a loving and giving plant that has so much. I won't get too woo-woo because whenever scientists get the woo-woo,
All right, yeah, we get the scarlet letter.
It's oh no, look, they're talking about the unquantifiable over there, and it's but it is unquantifiable to me the way that it makes me feel that it's a living plant that produces something that we sacrifice to use as medicine, and we've cultivated it. I'm super excited. I'm growing it for the first time this year, so I'm really excited about that because I
noticed that. Yeah, I was following on your social media. I'm really excited for you. That is That's awesome.
I think I'm
journey.
gonna learn so much about. I mean, it's something that I have a lot of
Absolutely.
houseplants and stuff, but I didn't try hard enough the one time that I tried to do it before. I also didn't have the time for it. I mean, like I think it's gonna take.
Yeah.
I at least to learn it from in the beginning. I want to like learn. I want to learn it, and
Yeah.
but I mean, I'm sure I'm gonna learn a lot just from seeing it like actually happen. Like the plant's just so beautiful too. Like.
It is. I love watching cannabis grow. I mean, I'm a big gardener and everything else, so I love plants in general, but there is something about cannabis that it is a pretty plant to watch to grow, and then as it matures and the way it changes and the colors that come out and everything, the well, I guess I won't talk about the first time I ever grew. I don't know if that's safe to talk about, but
We'll just all be here making assumptions.
Right, yeah. I have had great experiences growing cannabis, and I remember I'll never forget the first time that I grew it, and it was just one of these things. I was like, golly, I just really love watching these plants grow. They change really fast. I mean, depending on what you're doing, and it's kind of totally different indoors versus outdoor, and I've kind of had that differential. But it is a really fun plant to grow, and then you stack on top of that knowing how the end product is going to either affect yourself or other people, and that just makes it even the experience even richer at that point. But even if you took all that away, just as a plant itself, I love it. I don't know what it is.
I mean, it's so giving. I feel like and I think that's why too, like, I've been so grateful for, in terms of sharing, like, more about, like, my personal journey with cannabis and mental health and the science. But I think also, like, the science has been amazing to share because I love science too. But I think by far one of the best things that has come from me being more open and more visible about, like, just identity and journeying and everything has been meeting other people who feel that way about it, because that is something that we share that is undeniably, to me, it's on the level of, like, religion. It's on the level of religious community. It's on, I feel a kinship with you that we feel that way about it. And I'm not trying to equate it or make any assumptions to other people about their own religions or their own spiritualities or anything. I'm just saying that it helps me feel connected to you, that we feel that same way, and that is a kinship. Like, it's a level of community and closeness that I've been able to find through sharing cannabis science and cannabis and how it is for me,
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too, like, will that, because that's my experience, and I wonder if for future generations if it'll be the same. Because one thing that I think about in terms of kind of the weight that a relationship with cannabis carries is that for people that are particularly in their 30s or older, maybe some folks in their late 20s remember some of these days, but, like, when we were growing up, it was a pretty serious thing to decide to have a relationship with cannabis. A lot was not known. That's known now in terms of therapeutic applications and other things. It was viewed even more taboo than it is now, and riskier than it's considered now. And, for, like, someone like myself growing up in Mississippi where, if you decide you want to have a relationship with cannabis, you're literally putting your whole life at risk.
Yeah.
To do that, and it's an expression of your genuine engagement with your life and your time on this planet, and trying to understand how to improve quality of life and navigate all sorts of different things related both to your physical self and ailments and pains and all of that sort of stuff, but then also exploring consciousness and those sort of aspects. And so for me, that's where some of that kinship comes from, is knowing that you've gone through that sort of similar journey, even though it's different than mine, your connection to the plant stems from a very personal, authentic journey, of just trying to get through life and understand your place here and everything. And it's something I think about a lot. I wonder after cannabis is really totally normalized, which we still have a long way to go. But once we get there, I wonder if people will still feel that same sort of kinship, because I do think it carries a special weight today that is changing over time. But it is something I think about, and I wanted to check in with you just to be respectful of your time. Are you good on time?
Yeah, I gotta take off here in
I know we've been going for an hour.
Yeah, I gotta take off here in 10 minutes or something like that. But
okay.
This has
been. Well, we'll definitely have to have a follow-up.
Yeah, it's such a good conversation. This is so cool.
I know, and we haven't even actually gotten into your research or anything yet.
Yeah.
So we've definitely got to do a part 2, because I want to actually dive into all of that and give you a chance to unpack, what you've studied and where your head's at in terms of the endocannabinoid.
Yeah, I mean, that one will be, I'm really excited. I, did not expect us to talk about these topics, but I think that this is,
Me neither. I did not plan this at all.
This is really, but this is really nice. It's been a really good, and safe and open conversation for this to happen, which I'm super appreciative of, because, it's important. And, I'm really excited that we're going to be able to share this with people. And I think that, I don't know. I love the way you put it, that, your relationship with cannabis, when we chose to be that way, it was, very different than what it is now. And I don't know. And that's a really interesting question. Is it going to be how people in Southern California, are used to good weather? Is it going to be something like that, where then you just get used to it and it's just which that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the plant can help so many people, that then the access to the plant, helping so many people is better. But yeah, I mean, I feel like it definitely was a choice it was the first choice out of all the choices that I made to live outside of what I should do, or should be done by, I don't know who they even are.
But there's always
everyone.
They're always there.
Everyone. I want to schedule. Well, I would love to talk about my research, the trajectory and that kind of stuff too. And I also would love to talk about the therapy thing, the educating therapists.
Yeah.
I think that's super important, and I think that we potentially could do a fun wives a fun
I know. I've actually been trying to seed this idea, but just because
I know that's great. We have
parallels.
so much in common. So we're both Aspie scientists, and then our wives have migraines that work in the mental health, psychology, neurodiversity field. This has been really cool. I didn't know any of that before we connected either. I only knew you from the natural products side.
Well, and that's, again, this is also going back to what I said of I'm a hermit for a long time. Then I'm I want to share my personal life, but what? And I'm going through this is active therapy for me this year, as I'm trying to let people know who I am and all of that sort of thing. So that's not unusual, because I've gotten that feedback.
I love it. I loved finding out who you are. So I hope that,
Likewise.
I hope that I think that this is such a cool convo, and I'm really excited to do another one. I don't know, I think that this just so many other things. We talked for a long time, and I'm what did we even talk about?
I know, yeah, and really, really important stuff. So yeah, we'll set up another one after this and do part 2 and get into all the other stuff. No problem. And I know you need to run, but I guess I'll close out by just saying thank you so much for taking the time. And I know we've tried to connect. It's really been over a year or so, but it sounds like you and I were both going through some pretty challenging periods of our lives over the past year and a half or so. And so everything happens in good time. So I'm glad that we did finally connect and our paths are crossed now. I'm really excited to see what we do in the future.
Yeah, I'm such a believer in that timing. when the timing, when there's synchronicity around something, like that, sometimes I lean towards like time doesn't exist because it's a man-made construction of how, like, we just
of how we think about space.
Exactly, like it's a metric that we invented. I mean, and that's complicated because people are like, what do you mean time doesn't exist? I could wait 30 minutes and time has passed, and I'm like, yeah, but like, what does that mean? But that whenever something like this happens, when there's like so much synchronicity, I kind of just feel like it was meant to happen in the time that things are meant to happen. And I'm like, we wouldn't have had this conversation if we had connected earlier, even though we've been connected for like, a while. Like we've been connected for we've been on each other's radars for a long time, trying to like make it meet up and make it happen. And no, I am so like feeling like this was the right time and that it was like a very synchronous like event to come together. And I'm excited. We'll do something again really soon. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I appreciate it. And everyone listening, if you made it all the way to the end, I appreciate you as well. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening. And consider this part one of however many parts we go. But this conversation will definitely be to be continued. So with that, everybody, stay curious and take it easy. And I'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon so you get notified of more videos, and go ahead and check out another video while you're at it.